Whole conference is so interesting for me because I'm always thinking about ways of teaching these materials and learning more about them, and so I'm excited to hear your thoughts about this so that I can benefit from your teaching expertise, which I'm sure exceeds mine to a great degree. But what I want to talk about today in connection with this question about this general question that we've been asking these past couple of days, what were people's daily lives and experiences generally like? I want to just take a piece of that question and focus on it today, and a piece that I think kind of underlines what a lot of us are really interested in, or at least I am, right, when asking this question, which is, what were the most intimate and personal realm of experience like? What were the inner worlds of Soviet citizens like, right? We often refer to this as a Soviet subject. What were people's sense of who they were, their sense of self? So we ask questions like, what did people think? How did they view themselves? How did they view the world around them, right? Another way of asking this question, in light of the previous talks that you've had about the new man, right, and this concept of transforming human nature and transforming human consciousness, was how successful was the regime in doing this, right? By looking at the experiences and trying to access the inner thoughts, personalities, and attitudes of people, we can then maybe evaluate some of the efforts of the regime. Another way to put this generally is, how did people understand themselves personally, politically, historically, right? How do they see themselves and the world in it? Now, this is, of course, a really difficult question to answer, even though many of us, including myself, are really interested in it. And it's really critical, I think, for the Soviet context in particular, because the regime made it its mission to transform the way people thought, right? Not just the way they behaved outwardly, but to try and infuse them with the proper proletarian consciousness. This was the linchpin of the revolutionary aims. And one of the big phenomena, one thing that no matter what side you take in this debate, everyone seems to agree that Soviet people at all times were extremely eager to narrate their own lives, to discuss their own development as individuals. They did this through private channels and through public spaces, so they did use the channels provided by the regime. And they did this both voluntarily and under some measure of coercion, right? And the regime, as many of you read about and also we've discussed, the regime encouraged this process of self-reflection and self-narration, to get people to practice rehearsing the story of their lives. And as early as 1919, right, when the country is in the middle of the Civil War, there were already initiatives to create a biographical institute whose job it would be to collect people's autobiographies and their memoirs, their CVs, other kinds of expressions, right, official and unofficial, personal and public, of their lives. And this continues and it explodes when we get to Glasnost, and we get to the 1980s, when there's this new openness, right, that's encouraged, and then it explodes even more so in the 1990s. And you can find a huge number of memoirs and accounts of the Soviet experience. I saw somebody had Irina Papirno's book, right? This is her focus. She talks about this huge outpouring of narrations. This is what my life was like, right? This is what I experienced. And a lot of these now are online. So you can go to LiveJournal and read a huge number of accounts. So there's both the regime's emphasis on this and then this private individual commitment as well, right? And what kinds of sources can we use? I mean, the problem with this question is it's not, it's extremely elusive. How are we going to possibly access this thing that we think exists, right? Some kind of sense of self, right? Some kind of personal, private notion of self and identity. How are we going to possibly access this? And there are a lot of ways that scholars have tried to do it. And so my goal with you today is to talk about some of these ways of doing it, methods of doing it, with the idea that in your own classes, when you teach autobiographies, memoirs, letters, diaries, you can then bring some of these questions to the fore for your students. There are two major divides of types of sources. Can you guys see? Am I sitting like right in front of my slide? You can see? All right. And interestingly enough, they're not in chronological order, but the categories are. So in the early period of studying this topic, there was much more emphasis on textual sources. So things like autobiography, memoir, diary, testimonials. Anytime someone had to apply for a membership, be it to a union or for a promotion, or for party membership, for the KOMSOMOL, they were forced or asked really to give their biography, to give an account of who they were, how they had developed, how the revolution had transformed them, and so on. So there are textual examples. There's also forms, right? Things that start with what's your name, what's your occupation, what is your social origin, all these things. And if we look at those over time, for example, one of the people I work on, in her file, she has about 8 or 9 different versions of this form, right? And over time, the way she describes herself is very different. She will change what she puts as her ethnic background, right? She'll change her class origin. So these are not just documents that we can take at face value. We can actually really work with these, right? And letters. Writing letters, especially to the authorities, was something that was encouraged from day one. Seems sort of interesting in a way and counterintuitive to what we think about the Soviet Union, but it was considered a kind of direct form of democracy. So even from the very start, you have people writing directly, often to Stalin, but to other political figures, to editors and publishers of newspapers and journals where they read something they didn't agree with, right? And they would voice their opinions and explain in the process who they were. Right? In order to legitimate their opinion, they had to present themselves as a reliable source. So that's another one we can use. And then over time, especially in the past 5 or 6 years, this is a really new topic, so my presentation of it will probably be much less coherent than the ones you've heard so far, are these non-textual kinds of sources, even harder to access. So things like display, appearance, consumer kinds of choices, spaces and relationships. Are these actually the way that one's sense of oneself gets developed, right? For example, display would be making choices about your personal appearance, consumer kinds of choices, right? Tattoos. These are other forms of physical display, perhaps, of identity, of subjectivity, and that's something we can talk about. And I would just mention that one thing I find interesting about this is that you can just see from the types of sources that I mentioned, they all really reflect very different approaches, different disciplines. And this is a real interdisciplinary topic. It's historical. It deals a lot with literary criticism, right, when you're dealing especially with textual sources, but also anthropological and sociological as well. So we're moving beyond the realm of history here. Of the types of sources, the one the regime most encouraged were these textual sources, biographies, memoirs, and diaries in particular. So again, the question is, how can we teach these types of sources? And I don't know about you, but the kind of stuff I love to teach, right, is something like a memoir or a diary in a class. So the question is, how can we help students unpack them and interpret them? How did people articulate themselves? What kinds of things can we pay attention to in the text? And moreover, can we these people, especially with their textual sources, to what degree can we take them at their word, right? And to what degree do we want to read in between the lines? So I think of my discussion today as really activity focused. So that means that please jump in if you have experiences with certain texts or readings or moments in class you want to share. Some of the texts I mentioned I hope will be ones that you've also looked at, so feel free to give me your own views on that. My goal is to just provide a range here. A range of scholarly approaches to tackling this problem, and then a range of ways that the regime tried to do it as well. So I'm going to go roughly from the 30s through about the 1960s, 1970s, show you how this problem of subjectivity changed for the regime and the various ways scholars have tried to address it. All right? But the spoiler here is that I've got no solution for you. I have no coherent model of Soviet subjectivity that I'm going to offer you. And in fact, I think the problem with this field so far is that we've been so concerned about developing a coherent model. This is what the Soviet person was like at all times, in all places. There's a real tendency to want to do that, and I would suggest to you that we focus instead on these fluctuations, on inconsistencies in people, and how people in the USSR broach this task of self-cultivation, and also inconsistencies in the regime as well. So my argument, if I can call it that I'll present to you, is that there's a major shift that takes place, both in how the regime deals with this issue of self-development, transformation of consciousness, and in how people tackle it, and that shift happens with World War II. So as an aside, here I'm going out on a limb, because the consensus or the standard wisdom in my field is that it's the death of Stalin. right? That we have before Stalin and we have after Stalin. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's actually the war that changes that. So feel free to argue with me on that point when we get there. All right, so I'm going to suggest that we don't need to look for one model of the Soviet subject. I'm going to say he's not a conformist or a rebel or a con man or a devout or a consumer, right? All of these models that have been proposed, I would say at times he was all of these things, right? So that neither the Soviet narrative nor individual expressions of subjectivity are stable, consistent, or coherent. That's my own take, all right? I don't see us as very consistent beings, I suppose. The reason I'm trying to talk about questions today is because I found in teaching some of these sources that the questions my students raise, or the assumptions my students raise, and you can let me know about yours, are the same questions that scholars ask, and they're the same assumptions that scholars bring. For example, when they come into class, especially in the beginning, and they've just read an account from the 1920s, right? For example, from the collection done by Sheila Fitzpatrick and Yuri Sloskin. I forget the title of that, but and by the way, I have a whole list of these kinds of sources you can teach in your class that have been translated into English. If you're interested, I can let you know about that afterward. But after reading, let's say, an account of a woman during the revolution in the 1920s, people come in with one or two views, right? One that privileges totalitarianism and one that privileges resistance. These are the most common reactions I've seen. The first view, this totalitarian view, is that, well, this was a totalitarian society. Those types of societies deprive individual minds of the freedom of thought, right, or control over their own consciousness. So the way that we can read this document is that people were either so indoctrinated, right, that they just believed everything, or they were too afraid to say anything different. Right? This is how we can understand the way that they articulated who they were. This student sentence I hear most of all is, well, people were brainwashed, right? And this is the explanation I most often get from trying to explain things like, why was the regime so popular, right? Why did the regime last so long? Well, people were brainwashed or they were too afraid, right? This is one really common reaction. A way to deal with this, I've found, is to historicize and say, you know, that's a legitimate point of view. And in fact, scholars from the period between the 1930s and 1960s, this is the main viewpoint they took. This is the main way that they explain this, right? You can think about Hannah Arendt, you could think about the 1930s, the mass man, atomization of modernity, right? All these theories that developed between the world wars and after World War II. Sometimes giving students that kind of information can help both validate what they think, but also get them to think about other possibilities as well. So that's one reaction. The other reaction that I most frequently get, perhaps you get too, is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And that is, instead of seeing basically the Soviet subject as non-existent or entirely controlled by the regime, this is this kind of resistance model, right? That who can we trust? Which voices are most accurate, the most sincere? Well, the ones that are most critical are most accurate, right? The ones that critique the regime the most, that's really what the Soviet experience was like, right? It's this kind of negative fallacy that you get from students. That all people, we can say, outwardly conformed, but inside, internally, they maintain some true private sense of self that was different and detached from what the regime wanted. This is another really popular view, right? The problem with these, I would just mention you can historicize this as well, right? And if you think about the period of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when major dissident accounts were published from the Soviet Union in the United States, right? Solzhenitsyn's work, Sakharov's work, Milosh, Kravchenko, these were all extremely critical, right, views, and views that proposed this really distinct public sphere and private sphere, that the two were opposite. One was inside, right, the private, and everything else was public, right? Very black and white, very clear. You can historicize that for your students as well and say, this is also a take that scholars have taken for a long time, right? And it also comes historically out of this period of perestroika, when both Western and Soviet scholars were very excited about this possibility of resistance, of questioning the regime, and they saw it everywhere. Right? Just like we were interested in totalitarianism, we saw it everywhere. The problem I would suggest with these kinds of theories is that they're very one-dimensional, they're overly coherent, right, of historical actors. They don't leave any room for change over time, right? People always resisted, or they always were indoctrinated, it treats the self as kind of a fixed entity, like it's a product of an environment rather than the self as a process or something that gets developed and changed over time. So for me, again, I think the key to understanding this issue is to move away from these kind of singular, overly consistent, coherent views of humanity, and to try and not take our own assumptions and our own dichotomies that structure our understanding of human experience and impose them upon this society. For example, the Soviet Union flouted a lot of these concepts, these categories we take for granted. We're trying to study, right, everyday life at an extraordinary time where things were anything but ordinary, right? We're trying to study private life under a regime that sought to abolish it, right? Individual experience under a regime that privileged the collective, right? All of these concepts, ordinary, extraordinary, public, private, self, other, personal, shared, all of these things, we have our own understanding of them from our own society, and when we take them and impose them upon another, sometimes we project our own attitudes onto there, right? And when we look at accounts, this situation gets really muddied, which is why I think, at least for me, it's a useful teaching tool. So the big questions for historians, and I would say for students as well, are the following. And note, these are not historical questions, right? That's part of the problem. Is the self something that's stable or dynamic, right? Does our sense of self change over time? How much agency or choice is involved in individual development, right? Do we make who we are, or how much are we influenced by our cultures, our societies, our relationships, political environment? A bigger question, and one that gets people crazy. I saw somebody storm out of a lecture hall in a talk in response to this one, right? Because he just couldn't handle it, and that is, can we ever access the quote-unquote authentic self, or are people's real beliefs, or are we always just looking at expressions of it, right? And the last one is, how does form shape content, right? How does the genre of something we're looking at affect the way it reads, right? Or how does the language that was used at the time in society affect the way we interpret? If somebody uses all of the terms of the regime, are we more likely to see them as someone who's been heavily indoctrinated, who's internalized those concepts, or someone who's simply appropriating them because that's the vocabulary they have access to, right? All right, so for me, in my view, is to try and go back to more historical questions which I think are more answerable, right? Look at artifacts, displays of the self, expressions of the self, rather than look at theories. Look at change over time, and look at anxiety about the self rather than looking for stability, right? I don't want to presume the regime was successful, and I don't want to presume it was a failure, right? And those two earlier views I talked about do that. They take that for granted. So to now be a bit more concrete, talk a little bit about periods of time and the ways that the regime approached this task, which I mentioned and others have mentioned was one of their primary goals, this transformation of human nature and of human consciousness. And also mention to you some of the arguments that take place around these periods. I won't talk too much about the 20s. I know you mostly did that yesterday, but just to remind you, the Bolsheviks took power, right, before the full development of proletarian consciousness. They took power at a time that was opportunistic and strategic. So they believed it was the role of the party then that would create proletarian class consciousness. And almost immediately after taking power, they denounced all pre-war class identities, conventions of self-expression, and social norms, which they said were infused by bourgeois consciousness. And this then creates instant insecurity for people about themselves, right? And it fosters this culture of self-criticism. Because who you were, how you identified, what you thought, people were told, was illegitimate, right? Was based on the system of exploitation. So you need to think really hard about who you are, where you've come from, and about the source of your attitudes, right? In the 19-teens and 1920s, the regime pursued this objective, but they really did it through social programs. And the idea was to create a nowy byt, right? A new way of life. This is a term that was just mentioned in the last talk. And so they did it through structures. For example, programs in education, housing, hygiene is a really big one, labor, terror, or as it was known then, re-education, right? That they would use kinds of structural programs to change the environment. And the idea was that if we change the the circumstances of people's lives, then they will then change inwardly, right, as a result of that. So that we can cultivate proletarian consciousness through these various types of reforms, right? We can create a situation where people learn, where they work, right? And so doing, they come to think of themselves as workers and have those proper attitudes. At the same time, people were very quick to pick up on how it was that they should present themselves in order to get promotions at work, to get memberships, to get new housing. So they started to present their lives in such a way that it revolved around the revolution, that the revolution was a kind of conversion moment, right? That would not only demonstrate their kind of ability to critique themselves, would reflect their purification, but their consciousness of their own transformation. So on my slides, I put in blue some of the scholars who have really focused on this stuff, if it's interesting to you. I just put their last names, right? But the people picked up really quickly in how to describe their own lives. Now again, the question, do they genuinely believe this? Is this a performance that they're doing? These are the things we have to ask, right, when we're reading these kinds of sources. I want to move, though, to the 1930s, because I think that the 30s is the moment that is focused on most in this debate. We have more writings about the Soviet person in the 30s than at any other time. And one reason for that is there's a really big shift in how the regime then approaches this change of human nature and consciousness. And that is that they say, all right, we'll continue to do this through labor, through circumstances, through education. But the key now is that individual people are responsible. They should initiate and monitor their own transformation. And this is the moment, the 1930s, when the regime encourages, right, heavy practices, particularly of diary writing among people. And the idea of a diary, at least at this moment, is to encourage this really self-conscious, deliberate meditation on who am I, right? How am I developing? How am I changing? And of course, a diary is also an account of just everyday life and events, right? Your routines, what you did that day. And the idea was to see the connection between what you did and how that then made you feel. So we have both documentary evidence that this was promoted in party cells, in universities, in factories, through the local party committee, in schools, tons of school children, diaries from school children, to work on this the transformation of themselves. It was called working on the self. So we go from a period in the 20s where we're talking about developing a new way of life to something called KULTURNOST in the 30s, which is to develop the self, to become cultured, to become, I think, as cultivated actually would be another way to look at it. So this is a very self-conscious moment for the regime. How have we approached this phenomenon? Well, there have been two really big discoveries, and then I want to give you some examples so you guys can let me know what your own reading is of these texts. There are two big breakthroughs really for historians at this time when these huge collections, these huge archives of diaries and other sources were uncovered. And two changes that make it really different from those earlier models I mentioned of either the sort of totalitarian view or the resistance view. And the first one is that people and historians really began to realize that subjects, that people are really embedded in their own society and in a particular society. So why look at totalitarianism in general or people in general, right? This resistance view is predicated on the idea that people in general resist authority, they resist the state at all costs, right? To try and preserve their own private life, to pursue self-interest and so forth. These are universal kinds of models. And one of the big changes here with the 30s is let's look at Soviet society in particular, right? Why did people have to go through these rehearsals? What was at stake? Well, really high stakes in the Soviet Union, that if you learned how to do this well, you would be rewarded with promotions, with privileges, certainly, higher status, also things like social acceptance and the need to belong, right? To feel like you're belonging and participating. Conversely, if you didn't learn how to do this successfully, right, you could be threatened with arrest and other types of things as well. And diaries were the #1 piece of evidence used by the secret police to discover somebody's guilt, right? Because it didn't matter if you had done something or not. A diary would reflect who you were at heart, so we could see if you are guilty in the way that you thought, right? Do you think like an enemy, even if you've never done anything that's illegal? So the diary was seen as this sort of window into the soul, and it was used by the regime for that purpose. We have a lot of diaries that have been underlined by secret police officials so that we can see what things they found incriminating in particular. Yeah.
So were people actually, I suppose how it might be difficult to answer, but then did people self-edit? Like if their journal was going to be read by the NKVD or what,
Yes.
I mean, how?
Well, the short answer to your question is yes, right? But here's something to think about, that we have now both diaries that we know were shared. For example, you would keep one with your brigade. How many of you looked at the collection Intimacy and Terror? You seen that published collection? A couple of people. So there are some diaries in that account of young men at universities who then would go to work or go to school and actually be asked to read out portions of their diaries. This was also done at party meetings to show how you had transformed, right? So they would have to read out portions. Now, some of them knew this was coming, so clearly they have an audience in mind. Some of them did not and were just asked to do it on the fly. Other people wrote entirely independently of this. They were lifetime diary keepers. They always did it, right? And so when this whole movement came around, this didn't affect that choice at all. Interesting thing, though, is that the diaries that were written with an audience in mind and the diaries that weren't read very, very similarly. They use the same kind of language, right? Dealing with the same kinds of issues. So that's one thing. Another thing is this issue that I want to bring up later, but we might as well put it on the table now, and that is this disjuncture between writing and life, right? It's one thing to write your experiences, it's another thing to live them. And I know for myself, and you may find this as well, that anytime you put pen to paper, you're already thinking about how to shape what it is you experience. How can I make this come across? How can I describe this? There's always going to be this disjuncture between text and life, right? That's sort of inevitable, I think, right? Otherwise, all of us would be incredible writers. We're clearly not. So that's an issue as well, right? So in the 30s, we have this, people are writing this voluntarily. They're obviously also writing because there's certain pressures or motivations. What do we do with this? How do we make sense of this, right? And again, these questions about freedom and constraint, all those things, performance versus authentic self, these are all permeating, right? This is what makes these texts so rich and so difficult. The new consensus, at least among scholars at this time, were twofold, two discoveries. One is that we need to look at the specific circumstances, right? The specific regime. We don't need to talk about people in general. We want to look at these subjects. The other was that people have some measure of agency. They have some measure of control. The debate, of course, was about how much control that they had, right? How much were they influenced by their environment, their circumstances, and how much were they initiating this process on their own terms, right? But they've moved, at this point, scholars began to move away from the idea that people were kind of automatons that simply just responded the way they were supposed to, right? When you read these rich diaries, you no longer think of people as mechanical. It's one of the advantages of teaching these types of sources. All right, but the disagreements here are much bigger than the agreements in the 30s, and I just want to mention some of them to you because you may encounter these as well. The first model of the self, I think, that scholars proposed based on the 30s is this kind of usable self, this pragmatic self. This is the self that is performed, right? And some of you looked at the book Everyday Stalinism, I think. Sheila Fitzpatrick is a big proponent of this view, that what we should look at is not so much self, which we don't know what that is, it's nebulous, but we should look at persona or identity or role, because that's something we can measure, right? And this was this discovery that people constructed themselves to look like loyal citizens in their autobiographies, in their letters, in their forms and questionnaires and applications. So she calls this people's file selves, right? So in other words, it's like their lichная дело, it's like their personal file. So let me construct for you who I am. The way you write like a CV, right, or a cover letter. It's how you present yourself. She argues this is what we have. Another source that we have for accessing this, she says, are letters of denunciation. Because, again, in order to denounce somebody or complain, you have to present yourself as a legitimate source, a trustworthy source. So this is one way of reading these kinds of documents. I just want to share this one with you and see what you think. I'll try not to read the whole thing, but this is a letter of complaint from collective farmers, kolkhozniki, right, to the big bosses. And again, people were not afraid to just write to the president or write to the general secretary and tell them how they felt, right? So we have to keep this in mind when we're keeping in mind this atmosphere of fear and terror and self-censorship as well. So here's an example, right? Our position in the kolkhoz and the collective farm is pitiful. Comrades, answer us please where we can find justice. We've often read the papers and seen in them what great evil has been done in our Soviet Union by enemies of the people. So already, right, we have the discourse of the regime is being used, clearly, right? They know what the accepted language is and they're using it, right? Of the right is Trotskyite bloc, all right? Now these are peasants and someone is helping them write this, but they know the categories, they know the terms, right, the tone, how widely it's spread, how they wrecked agriculture, how many horses perished, right, pedigreed cattle, blah, blah, blah. Here's the part I want to draw your attention to in terms of what does this tell us about the subject, right, or at least presentation of the subject. We as kolkhozniki, we as collective farmers, people still unenlightened, cannot get justice. For example, in our kolkhoz, there's a very large amount of stealing of kolkhoz property, and then they move on to denounce specific people, including the police chief, right? But there's this presentation of self there. Now, is this merely just presentation? Is this done as a means to an end? Is there some measure of internalization here? Or is there not? These are the kinds of questions that we're faced with when we find this kind of document, right? What do we make of it? But here they're reporting directly about a major member of the secret, local chief of the secret police, right? And they're doing so using the terms that they think will be most effective for the regime. So someone like Felix Fitzpatrick would read this and she says, this is a usable self, right? This is somebody presenting themselves, performing a role in order to get what they want, right? She calls the denunciation, this is sort of democratic political participation of the little man. This is how she uses it, and that they're using official channels to empower themselves. Now, notice in that theory of the self, there is no ideology, right? It's just calculation of advantage here. And there's no discussion of true belief. And that's not an issue for her. She says it's unknowable, right? That we can't really look at genuine self-exploration. Now, other people would look at this and disagree, right? And this is where I get to this second view, which is this, what I call the negotiated self. And this is this idea of the self as a dynamic model that's somehow both shaped by individual initiative, but also by their circumstances of various people. One of the first people to really propose this was a man named Stephen Kotkin, who described self-development in the Soviet Union as a process of maneuvers and counter-maneuvers, right? Where Soviet citizens are made by the society, by the categories, the policies, the language, the symbols that they're embedded in, but they also make it themselves, including through various forms of resistance. Now, Kotkin proposed this model to remind us that this kind of language is important, that this suggests some kind of internalization if they're going to identify in these ways, and even more subtle things, that they know the right kind of language to use that's effective, right? It reads emotionally, it reads sincerely, even if perhaps we don't know for sure if it was. But Kotkin began to open the door to think about the possibility of both genuine belief and internalization, right? So that these people are not, as themselves, completely free of their circumstances, they're embedded in those circumstances, right? Others would take this even further, and this is this third model that I call the sort of true believer, the Soviet person as true believer, or the illiberal self. This was a really hot topic a couple of years ago, led up by people like Igor Helfand and Jochen Helbeck. And their argument is different. They say this language is the key. It's a key sign of internalization, because if you can't think outside of certain terms, then those are the terms that shape your mental world, right? Does that make sense? So that it's not about ideas and then we think of a way to phrase them, that the phrases, the language is actually fundamental to the way that we think, that we can't think outside of the words that we know. This is their idea, or the idea that they borrow from other people. So they see in this process not a performance of the role, but genuine, true belief of people to fashion themselves, right? This was the term most often used, to refashion themselves as Soviet people, all right? So Helbeck in particular, oh yeah, question.
Well, we don't know what they were thinking, though.
We don't.
So we just know what's written.
We just know what's written.
So we don't know how many words they have in their head.
We don't, right? Absolutely. And again, this is something that, right, language philosophers debate over, right? There's Lucien Febvre's idea of unbelief, right? That we don't, they had no way of thinking outside of certain things. So this is the sort of realm of questions about epistemology and ontology, what it means to be, how people think. Absolutely. And all of that stuff is wrapped up in these historical debates. So yes, we don't know, right? All we have in this case is the text. But how are we going to interpret it? That's the real question. And others who took this sort of this model of the illiberal self interpret it such that people are genuinely trying to transform themselves. They're trying to purge themselves of bourgeois thoughts, right? And they really are doing this with the goal of replacing that I with a we, of sort of fusing themselves into the Soviet collective, all right? Integrate themselves into the regime. And they do struggle. They struggle to do this, but if we look at private texts, which is what Helbeck mostly did, he looked at private, unpublished diaries, most of which were not read by the regime. He said you could see this process taking place of people writing this. Now again, how private is private? How voluntary is voluntary? This is the argument that he made. But let me give you an example of some of the sources that he uses and the way he reads them and why he might make this argument. So this is the diary of a member of the KOMSOMOL, right, young man, writing in 1933. I've just read through a couple of pages how much of his own diary, all right? So this is to give you an example of sort of self-criticism and self-transformation. So I just read through a couple pages of my own diary. How much emptiness, how little reflection of life. The life about which people write books. They rear heroes, but what do I have? I will try to be more detailed and more prosaic in writing about myself at home and at work. Or the end of the notebook is approaching. The notebook spans almost 8 months, and then he says, i.e., 2/3 of a year. Very precise, he's an engineering student. But life is very incompletely illuminated. It is even very, very slightly illuminated. There are lots of thoughts in there, but little on essence, right? So here's an example of somebody writing. This is a quote-unquote private account, right, that they're writing voluntarily. But we know, again, they have incentives, positive and negative, who's criticizing themselves for how they write, right? I should be writing like this. This is the way to keep a diary. How little I'm focusing on the essence of life, right? Here's another example of the type of source that Helbeck uses, which gives him and others the impetus to make this kind of argument. This is on the anniversary of the October Revolution. Another young man and activist. A lot of these guys are young, male, and activists, which may greatly influence why they write in this particular way. But how good it is to feel, live, and win in the struggle. There was not, and there will not be in world history a generation more happy than ours. Now remember the slogans you heard last time, right? These are very similar. We are the participants in the creation of a new epoch. Do you remember, enemies? You who are encircling us from all sides, that only 20 years ago we were puny insects crawling on masters' floors. Right? Remember this whole, we were people in chains, we were backwards, right? And then this paltry person, strangled by capitalism, comprehended himself as class, all right? So here's the switch. We were an insect, and then this paltry person comprehended himself as a member of a class, right? Class consciousness is the light bulb, and shattered the whole world to its foundations on November 7th, 16 years ago. There's nothing greater than to be a member, a citizen of the Soviet land, and to belong to Lenin's Communist Party. So again, if you give this to your students, or you find this in an archive, right, written by a young man who voluntarily gave his journal over to an archive at the end of the Soviet Union, right, did not have to share it with his comrades, what do you make of this text? Right? These are those questions that I presented at the beginning. Is this genuine belief? Is this the performance of a role? Right? Is this an example of how successful they were at transforming people into new men? Or is it not? Does it show individual initiative and agency, or some combination of those factors? Right? The model of self that Helbeck proposed and others is this illiberal self. This is this idea that a liberal self is someone who pursues autonomy, freedom from, right? Freedom from restraint, from the state, seeks self-interest, right? And thinks freely. And the idea that Helbeck proposes that these subjects don't actually want to do that, right? They're trying to eradicate those things. They want to join, they want to belong, they want to think like others, they want to be a member of a collective. So these are the types of sources that would lead him to make that claim. Now, lots of possible disputes, right? When you say Soviet subjects were illiberal, you're presenting that as an idea that is static and enduring. You're saying these are how they are for their nature, right? What about later periods? What about various events that might change how this develops? This is also a unified model. All people were like this when you say that, right? And you propose a model of self. Is that accurate? Or are there lots of different Stalinist subjectivities? There's also no discussion of the context here, right? If you're living in a society that's infused with terror, as the Soviet Union was in the late 30s, can you have genuine freedom of choice and moral choice, right? All of these kinds of factors. And then, of course, as Sean brought up, there's this disjuncture between text and experience, right? Can we even infer how this person feels from what they wrote? What do you guys think? I'm going to move it away from the 30s, which is the Stalin focus, right? And say the war, we can see the war as a major turning point. And again, feel free to question this and argue with me on this point, all right? But what's different about the war's circumstances? Well, the war, of course, was a huge transformation, marked a huge transformation of people's daily life, including, I would say, these practices of self-reflection and cultivation. So here I differ with people who argue that the Stalin period is more or less coherent. And the war, even though it was predicted as the inevitable cataclysmic clash between Western capitalism, imperialism, and socialism, it was anything but anticipated in the way that it played out. Right? The devastation, the destruction, the chaos greatly exceeded anyone's worst nightmares, right? And it forced the regime to loosen its sort of institutional grasp over millions and millions of people, many of whom were living under occupation, who had been taken as slaves and working in Germany or in concentration camps, POW camps, and so forth. And when we read accounts from the war, we see it raised a huge number of questions about the fate of the USSR, about the viability of its utopian projects, right? And that many, many people predicted that they would lose the war. They felt that this was the end. It's also, interestingly enough, a moment when this official script, these official categories, they're infused with added flexibility and greater uncertainty. If you read, for example, the discussions between writers and historians at this time of how are we going to talk about the war, where does it fit in our narrative of Soviet history, they haven't yet fully decided what's okay to say and not okay to say. And so when the narrative is a little suspended or the official script is suspended, people fill it in really with their own views. Right? They discuss more openly, I would argue, what the meaning of the war is for them and for their own society. Couple of really major findings about the war and personal accounts written from the war. So these are diaries during the war, letters in particular, and also memoirs and oral histories, is this discovery, first of all, that patriotism and sacrifice does not equal support for the regime or even loyalty. That people often fought, they did fight to the death, right? And they suffered sort of unspeakable things, but often not for the sake of socialism, but for the sake of their families or themselves or preserving something more personal, right? And this was something that the regime, a narrative that the regime contradicted very greatly when it said that our victory is proof of your loyalty, right? It's proof of the superiority of socialism. When you look at people's accounts, they hardly ever mention the party, right? So the slogan for fighting, for the charge of the Red Army was supposed to be, for the motherland, for Stalin, right? There's one oral history that I have of a woman who was a doctor in the army who said, no one ever shouted that. They may have shouted for the motherland, but they never shouted for Stalin, right? And so there's a moment of disconnect between the struggle that people are fighting and the reasons that the regime is supplying for why they're doing that. They're fighting individually. They're fighting in brigades. They become bonded with their fellow soldiers. People at the home front do as well, but they think more about individual strategies of survival, individual battles, think more about their comrades, and less about these big organizing structures that are supposed to be facilitating it all, right? There might be great love of their general, their own officer, but great disdain for the Red Army officer elite at the same time, right? And those things are not seen as contradictory. This is this idea that the war is a people's war, that the people take credit for the victory and they don't attribute the victory to the party or to the regime or to the elite leadership, all right? I also mentioned that it can be seen as a short-term victory and as a long-term defeat. And this is the idea that the war, on the one hand, is the moment, the most obvious moment of the regime's greatest victory. It's a victory, and it's not indecisive, right? At least on the European front. In the end, by 1944, it's very clear, right? And it's seen as this incredible victory, evidence, right, of the Soviet Union's ability to modernize, to wage warfare, its superiority, its morality, all of those things. But on the other hand, I would suggest that this is the beginning of long-term questioning that we can see continuing from the 40s through the 1980s. That the moment where people were supposed to be demonstrating their greatest loyalty was the moment of their greatest skepticism. And of course, this brings with it changes in the way that Sovietness was defined both by the regime and by individual people. So models of the self now that historians have based on the war years, they're very, very different than how we think of people in the 30s. So one big question for us is what happens to those selves in the 30s? Do people change between the 30s and the 40s? Or were we just seeing some kind of usable self or some persona that didn't actually exist? It was non-enduring. This is a big question. Two models that I would suggest. One is that the self is unknown and unknowable, that people see the self as sort of a foreign country. Right? Who am I? What am I? The other is of the self as someone who is entitled, right? Who presents themselves as the member of an entitled group. So let me just really quickly talk about that. So one of the big discoveries, and this is where my own work is that work on the self, these practices of writing diaries and monitoring oneself, this didn't end with the war. In fact, it got even more popular during the war for people who could do it. And the regime, even more than the 30s, asked people to keep diaries of their lives, which they then would collect and use to tell the story of the great Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War. So it is not something that gets suspended because of the chaos. People keep working on this task. They're still devoted to this process of self-narration. But the focus shifts, I would argue, tremendously. If we take the Helbeck line that in the 30s, it's about purifying the self and really destroying it, right? Replacing the I with the we. I want to be a member of a collective. I don't want to be an individual. Then what we see during the war is all about preservation of the self, preservation of the I, preservation or an attempt to create some semblance of self during conditions that were dehumanizing, self-effacing, that tried to deprive people of that kind of individuality. So my own work, for example, is on the Leningrad blockade, which many of you know is one of the worst episodes of mass starvation in history. Here's an example of a woman's passport photo, which she needed to get rations at 3 different dates, right? In the 1930s, in May 1942, and October 1942. And if you look at these photos, you can see, and of course the blockade is an extreme example, but I'm going to suggest for the war, you can see why notions of identity and self became unclear, right? All of these things that we think about ourselves are even as basic as age and gender, right, become unclear. If you look at that third photo and ask yourself, how old is that person? Is that a man or is that a woman? These things are become entirely unclear, right? And those are just the big things. Think then about occupation and family and all of the other things we use to orient ourselves. We lose all those anchors, become disoriented in our own society. I just want to give you one example of many diaries written during the war and one written during the siege in particular. This is a 16-year-old girl, so might be an interesting corollary to Diary of a Schoolgirl or the passages I read earlier from Helbeck's work. Her name is ELENA MUKHINA. One thing that fascinates me about her diary is this disjuncture between text and experience, and that is she tries to create ways or relies on literary techniques in order to problematize the self, problematize her own sense of self. And one of the major ways she does that is she switches from writing in the first person to writing in the third person. So she writes I, and then about a year into the war, she says, I'm going to write my diary now about Lena, right? About myself, about a girl named Lena. And she says this quite obviously. She just states it, right? And then what she does is she occasionally switches back and forth between the first person and the third person, often to write about the exact same events, right? But one from the perspective of an outsider, a kind of other that's looking back on herself. But you can see now how our notion that the self is coherent, consistent, unified, this is deliberately problematized by a text like this. It forces us, the way it's written on purpose, it forces us to think about these questions. And I just want to give you a tiny example. These are two entries. Here's one, and I'll show you the second, that were written back to back. And the premise for these is of Lena, or Mukhina, right, whether I or she, is looking in the mirror and trying to discover who she is. And she says, already my brain is unable to respond to anything. I live as in a half-dream. To be honest, it's quite funny. After all, I'm not some kind of invalid, neither an old man nor an old woman. I'm a young woman who has everything ahead of her. I'm happy and soon I'm leaving, right? This is also a fantasy. She thinks she's going to evacuate. I just lost my spot. Oh, okay. Meanwhile, I look at myself, and she's looking in the mirror at this point, at what I have started to resemble. An indifferent, melancholy expression. I look like a third-degree invalid. This is a particular category of person who is ill, who got special food rations. I can scarcely move. My legs barely hold me up. Myself I do not recognize. Earlier, perhaps a month ago, during the day, I had sharp pangs of hunger, and I developed the energy to find something to eat. For an extra bit of bread, something else to eat, I would have gone to the ends of the earth. But now I almost don't feel hunger. In general, I don't feel anything at all. Okay, so that's one entry. Right next to it on the page is this one. Lena gazes into the mirror, right? And she is pleased to discover that her normal appearance is returning. Her face was no longer as frightening as I had seen before, even though her body really had grown thin, just bones, and nothing remained of her swollen breast. Right? Now, both of these passages problematize some of these general categories of experience that we take for granted in formulating identity, age, gender, and so forth. And one is quite disturbing, and one is rather optimistic. And what do you make of this? And again, what do you do when you find this or you offer it to your students to read? Again, I think it takes us back to these two poles, which you just mentioned. I tried to mention at the beginning as possibilities between sort of the resistor and the totalitarian. But this is this other polarity, which is they're nothing like us, right? To they're just like us. And what makes living in the Soviet Union any different from living here, right? And so that's another kind of, as you bring up, difficult balance to work with, right? That we must work with. So on the one hand, we want to demonstrate what is outstanding and different about this, right? But on the other hand, I think we're also struck by some universal types of aspects. Yeah. So I don't really have a solution for you, but I definitely agree that that's the nature of this kind of work. So again, my task, which is small and maybe inadequate today, was to sort of present to you possibilities and ways of interpreting this stuff when and if you teach it in your classrooms, right? And so you can think about context, right? You can think about universal context. She's a female, she's 16, she's living in a city. You can contextualize her that way. You can also say this is a Leningrader, right? She's a member of the Komsomol. You can look at other kinds of specific political circumstances as well. And here you have them, right? This sort of third-degree invalid. This is deliberate use of categories of the regime, again, right? And there are lots of those in this account. So you want to both look at the particular and the universal at the same time. And really, I mean, in a way, it's unsatisfying, but that's kind of what history and the human experience is all about, right? Then move on to late socialism, very briefly. Let's see, I got 15 minutes, right? Yikes, all right, bad time management. All right, The other one I was going to mention from the war is this entitled self, which is sort of identifying based on your war identity, which is as a soldier, for example, or as taking up a particular role during the war, right? Defender of a particular city. I'm from Leningrad became an identity, right? I'm from the blockade, or I'm from Stalingrad. That was more than just a reference to where you were from. It was an indication of what you had been through, right? And those were also used, and a lot of scholars have discussed this, and in the same way in terms of writing letters, of demanding certain benefits, to say that I've served, I'm entitled, and that's something I want to mention now with late Stalinism, which is this period immediately after the war till the death of Stalin. And a lot of the things that I'm going to bring up here, I think, are also true for the 60s. And this is because I believe it's the war and not Stalin's death that was the key changer. And again, someone else would give you another perspective. But what's different in late Stalinism, what's different about this understanding of human consciousness that then influences how we think about it? The first one is that the Soviet identity became normalized. What do I mean by that? Well, in the first half of the Soviet period, the emphasis was on becoming Soviet, becoming proletarian. You were not it yet, but you would become it through work, through education, through rehabilitation, and so forth. But now the sense is that being Soviet is not defined by working on the self, but that you already are. Sort of by virtue of the fact that you've lived through this experience and you've survived it, and you're a resident of the Soviet Union now makes you Soviet in a way that Soviet was an identity, or proletarian was an identity that only certain people had in the first half of the period. But the sense is that because we've won, everyone has proven. They've proven their loyalty. They've sacrificed everything for the state, and so now we know you are all Soviet. Your consciousness has been transformed. So in that sense, it goes from becoming Soviet to simply being Soviet. And with that, I'll move away from seeing these socialist heroes as big men, as giants, right, and ideals, to the little man. Everybody has the proper consciousness. Everyone has sacrificed. Everyone has proven themselves. Along with that comes what I call a waning of utopianism, but a waxing of sort of utopian expectations. And that is that the regime had always said, someday we will have abundance, right? We will live in a society that's more equal, where the caviar is richer and the food is more abundant and the vodka flows, right? But first we have to build it because we're overcoming all these obstacles. And someday we will get there. So endure scarcity now, your children will have abundance. Well, when the war ends, the regime presents it as, this is it, right? Capitalism has been defeated. We know socialism is superior. So now people say, all right, great. Where is it, right? When is that abundance coming? If now the last wall is down, it should be here. And the regime makes this worse by promising people all things all during the war, right? Right now you are living on rations, but that is because the fascists have taken our food, and after the war there will be an abundance of bread. They make these promises all the time. They promise vet-specific things. They promise the general population specific things, and now people are wondering, where is it? And the abundance is supposed to come, right? There's no more excuses for why it's not here. The other is this great disappointment with the way that the reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, takes place. There's a number of ways in which this happens. One is that it's done without major reforms. There are no major social or political reforms. You sort of go back to life as it always was. And people had hoped that the harder parts of life, a lot of really a punitive arm of the state would disappear after the war had ended, but in fact, it didn't. It also took place without full acknowledgement of the tragedy or of the people's wounds that they had suffered. The regime instantly came out and proclaimed the war as a victory. They said everyone suffered equally, everyone sacrificed equally, and we will not discuss any particular cases of individuals suffering over any others. For example, there was no real acknowledgement after 1945 that Jews had suffered disproportionately to other people, right? And this became something that you were not allowed to discuss because it implied that we weren't all equal in our sacrifice. Same thing with a mother saying, well, I lost 3 sons. I mean, say, you can't say that because we all lost, right? And this kind of mentality that the war was a victory and that it wasn't personal, it was so shared and collective, robbed a lot of people of the sort of chance to really heal. It also drove this wedge between the party, which claimed that had led the people to victory, and people's actual experiences during the war, when often they were very much on their own trying to survive or trying to fight without a lot of structure. Right? They took credit, basically, for what people thought was their own achievement or their own suffering. And the regime gets very nervous about that. And very soon after, in the early 1950s, there are open discussions within the party about the problem of the individual. For example, the Writers' Union in 1950, they begin to discuss that we have to address the individual and the individual personality now. That people somehow became individuals. They were fighting to live on their own. They were so separate from the power of the state for these 4 years, and so we now have to contend with the role of the individual. And this was seen as a problem, but it was recognized as a reality. There's also a society that's groping with coming back from the war, where families remain disintegrated. A lot of men didn't come back. A lot of men survived but didn't return to their families, right? Lots of divorces, lots of women getting new husbands, women taking men's jobs, quote unquote, men coming back demanding those jobs. It's a moment of real social disintegration as well. We tend to understand, I'm going to skip a little here, we tend to understand the late Stalinist period and then the thaw in a very different way then, in terms of this issue of Soviet subjects, who they were, how they thought of themselves, right? And I'm going to just, the millennial clock is ticking. All right. They began to question that. One is vets, again, demanding certain things because of the service that they have provided, and using their new authority to challenge the state. And this is an example of this. Again, very similar to what you saw earlier, but now using new identity terms. There, no one says, I'm a kolkhoznik, right? That's my identity. The difference is now he says, I have served 3 years, right? And I was wounded 4 times, and I received a governmental award, and I expected local power would treat my family humanely, right? And then brings up the law. He says, perhaps the laws of the USSR regarding Army servicemen and the privileges of their families do not extend to you, right? But he basically says, you need to abide by these promises. Maybe there are those still among you who help the German fascists in their vile work and activity, right? So there's this whole new way of asserting oneself, one's authority, based on this new focal point of identities forged during the war. And this is something that's brand new. We also see in children's letters, especially members of the KOMSOMOL, are more and more critical. Many of their fathers didn't come back or didn't receive recognition or were arrested during the war for various crimes, and they write asking, we're model people, we don't understand how this could have happened. Right? But not in a naive way, in a critical kind of way. When the thaw happens after Stalin dies, when de-Stalinization occurs, open criticism of the party is encouraged and it takes place. But this transformational agenda still stays on the menu. Khrushchev promises communism is coming in your lifetime, right? And we will still be new, we still have this ideal of the new man, but it's the little man, right? We are all Soviet citizens now. In fact, things like class origins became much less important after the war in determining who got a job as opposed to the 30s, right? In a way, class warfare is supposed to be over at this point. The big difference that happens with late Stalinism and then with the thaw is that the promises of material abundance come reckoning. And in particular, the Cold War context, which encourages this direct competition with the West, pushes people, especially like Khrushchev, to promise that socialism is superior, not just morally, right, which we already know, and it's not just historically inevitable, which we already know, right, but that it's superior in production and consumption. Right? So in other words, we won't only outproduce the West, but we will provide you with a higher quality of life than the West can. We will also provide you with more welfare and security as well, right? And these promises about production and consumption, right, change the way then we see some of these manifestations of one's identity or one's self. In particular, in addition to looking at things like autobiographies and memoirs, we can look at external things like consumer choices. We can look at fashion and dress, right, as a way of expressing this. We also can look at tattoos in particular. This is also the moment where you have mass release from the Gulag, right? The Gulag, where tattooing was a huge phenomenon, right, which marked you as a prisoner, also could mark you in various other ways. And these people return once after Stalin's death, and we have all these new ways of representing oneself that aren't necessarily textual, right? And I'm way behind the time here, but I just want to give you an example of some of those, right? One is that we tend to look at subjectivity in this period in terms of youth, right? We identify a real cohort divide between generations. That's something that we don't emphasize when we look at the 30s or the 20s, but we really do beginning in the thaw. Another, as I mentioned, is this material self, the displayed self. Rather than articulate myself, I will display it for you. And the third is this kind of embedded self, that the self gets cultivated not in the individual, but in spaces. And two spaces in particular I want to mention to you. One is the kitchen, and the other is in front of the television set. I will try and talk a little bit about that quickly. These are tattoos, Gulag tattoos. With Khrushchev came the promise that people were going to have individual apartments, because now, of course, we're going to have abundance, right? And people are going to live on their own. Now, of course, this didn't always happen for a lot of people. Most people still lived in communal apartments. But this is a promise not just that you will have enough space, now you'll also have private space, right? And so the conversations that you have may not be overheard by your neighbors. And so the kitchen, for a lot of people, became associated as a place where privacy now happens, right? Or within the family, within the domestic sphere, is where you really cultivate your identity. This was something that was actually promoted by the regime as it tried to repair families in the post-war period, but inadvertently it also gave people another source, or what we see as sort of another source of identity outside of the one in the official realm. So a lot of socialist realism from this period is of indoor spaces, domestic spaces, having material goods. This is what socialism is going to look like, right? These are all paintings, right, of what the apartment is going to look like. But now it's not a huge mass kitchen. It's not a factory kitchen like the 20s. It's a table with 3 chairs around it, right? Another way of displaying this identity, and I'll try to end on this point so I don't go too far over, are the stivyagi. Do you guys know about the stivyagi? No? There's a new film that came out a couple years ago in Russia that I think has been translated into English as a great teaching tool on the stidyaga. But this is this youth culture phenomenon, but it's useful for us in understanding it as a kind of expression of self. There was a movement that developed among young men and women, especially men, beginning actually under Stalin. So it begins in 1949, that's when the term is coined, of being sort of, a stidyaga means like a hipster or like a style guy or being stylish. And this was this infatuation to looking different and being different and choosing clothes that were often Western-inspired, listening to Western-inspired music, right? Or just wearing things that were nonconformist. So clashing colors, big neckties. Now, of course, these guys, when I show these in my class, people are like, that person's a nonconformist? They don't look like that to me. But I will show you a couple more to give you a sense of how radical this kind of dress was. In the movie that came out recently, they tried to recreate this in color, which is much more effective. But this way of, rather than writing a diary or something, now I'm going to just develop who I am through these material kinds of choices. Because the Soviet Union emphasized consumption so much more now than they had in the pre-war period, consumer choices also became a way of doing that. So comment books, right? People going to stores, waiting in lines, writing comments about their experience, buying one thing over another. Fashion magazines, right? There's a whole consumer culture that grows up because the state is trying to dictate people's tastes. In the process, they get them to think a lot about taste and why it matters and why it's important as a kind of form of personal expression. The last one is TV. TV is going to make huge changes in that, the way that the regime relates to people and the way that they think of themselves. So we start seeing letters not of people to magazines and newspapers, but to television producers, right? Here's one that I want to mention to you of a young girl who lives in a small town 200 miles from Moscow. She says, one question interests me and all of my television viewing friends. By whose hand, this is a different letter. This one. All right, can you tell me, please, what's the cost of $1 or the British pound in relation to the Russian ruble? Who lives better, Soviets or Americans? Can you please compare for me? What are their salaries? How much do they pay for a loaf of bread? Their rents, their car, blue jeans, and this kind of thing. Not a dissident letter, she says, but a very simple, sincere, and excellent letter. So I don't want you to write to me in a way that's either, here she says dissident, right? But not a letter that's like critical. You don't have to be political about it. I just want to know, how are people living, right? This is another one. This is critical of TV producers. Someone said, this is about Posner, who did a particular coverage of an election. He says, by whose hand was Posner made political observer? At this point, elections for leaders are taking place in our country, in the localities, and we television viewers have full right to choose for ourselves those observers and commentators who express our point of view. Okay? So with new technologies, new events, new political circumstances, the ways that we at least access how people describe themselves and articulate themselves changes over time, and it moves more away from text and towards practice, choice, action, although you can see continuity with performance from the earlier era. So, also jokes is another big one, right? This is my personal favorite. What nationality were Adam and Eve? Russian, right? Only Russians can run around barefooted and bare-assed without a roof over their heads, where there's only one apple for two, and nevertheless they cry out they are in paradise. Now here's a great example of drawing on various categories, concepts, and making references, right? Materialism is definitely here, right? This is all about how we are poor consumers. We consume less, right? It's not about class. It's not about ideology. It's about these new situations, right? But on the other hand, this joke that everyone can recognize. There are various universal aspects. A couple other ones with the Pope, right? So again, the parameters, the categories are shifting. Brezhnev asked the Pope, why do people believe in a Catholic paradise but refuse to believe in a communist paradise? Pope says, because we don't show our paradise, right? And this again is related to TV. When TV producers come to your factory because they want to film a typical day at a model factory, right? You're going to know if they totally set the stage and manipulate what a typical day looks like. They can't do that the same way they could before, right? So there's a certain activity involvement of the TV producer that comes to reckon with the state. So basically, if we take all these models individually, we have all these different views of what the Soviet person was like. And I think rather than say in the 30s they were conformists, and in the 40s they were resistors, and in the 50s and 60s they were consumers, what I want to challenge you to think about is the ways in which they could be all these things, and perhaps all the time. We only notice or we can only access it at certain points versus others. But the big story, Sean, right? So here's what you can take home. Here's what you can tell your students, right? Without all of my massaging. The big shifts between the 30s and the post-war period in everyday life of the Soviet Union. Here it is. You waited a long time. Coercion to persuasion, right? So instead of sort of coercing you to change your consciousness, now we're just going to persuade you to do it. We're going to ask you to demonstrate it. We're going to show someone on TV, right? But it's now more persuasive. The violence is gone. Most of the fear is gone. From the big man to the little man, right? So from the sense that only certain people have mastered this and we should all try to be like them. Lenin, Stalin, right? These are the model Soviet figures. Sense is that we can all do it. No one was trying to be Khrushchev. No one was trying to be Brezhnev, right? No one modeled themselves on those people. Entitlement for some to entitlement for all, right? In the 30s, the best workers, the best proletarians were rewarded and other people were not, right? Class warfare. After the war, everyone's proved themselves, everyone is entitled. Everyone should be living in abundance. That's what becomes so hard for the regime to deliver, right? Becoming Soviet to being Soviet. There's a way in which the Soviet category and identity is no longer quote-unquote problematic after World War II, with the exception of certain groups like Jews, ethnic minorities, members of the intelligentsia that are still persecuted by class. But other than that, this whole idea of bourgeois versus proletarian, it's virtually gone. The idea is that war is over. It ended with World War II. So now we are Soviet, right? We just have to display it rather than work on it. All right? Collectivism with room for the individual. Remember, there's this acknowledgement that people fought on their own, right? They had very personal war experiences. We have to now acknowledge that. We can't ignore it anymore. From a war on privacy to room for privacy, and literally rooms of privacy, right? So if we're going to give abundance, we're giving more space, we're giving more stuff. How can we do that and still at the same time not teach materialistic values, give people opportunities for private conversation, and so forth? Those go hand in hand. And lastly, this shift from really textually based sources. This is a scholarly shift, right? From textual sources to looking at appearances, spaces, and actions. And the issue here is this a genuine shift that takes place, or is this just our ability to see the problem, right? That we can see it in more ways later on than we could earlier, all right? But again, the form shapes the content. So whether you're looking at a Stiliago or reading a diary, you're going to get really different views. All right. I had other conclusions, but I will skip them and just see if there are any last questions.